This is the true-to-life story of a woman who was fired in front of her entire team, told to her face that she just wasn't cut out for this. 11 months later, she stood on a stage accepting an award for the very industry that had thrown her out, and the man who fired her was sitting in the audience. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened in those 11 months, hour by hour, decision by decision. What she built during that time will surprise you, because it wasn't revenge that drove her. It was something quieter, and honestly more powerful. Before we start, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, and what time it is right now. I read every single one, and I want to know who's here at the beginning of this with me. In a mid-sized city known for its shipping port, there lived a 31-year-old woman named Elena. She worked as a junior designer at a mid-sized marketing agency, the kind of job she'd wanted since design school, the kind of job she'd told her parents, proudly, that she'd finally landed. For 3 years, she gave that job everything. Late nights before pitches. Weekends redoing work that clients changed their minds about at the last minute. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, and she wasn't naturally gifted at office politics, but she was quietly, consistently good at the actual work, the kind of good that shows up in the results, even when it doesn't show up in how loudly someone talks about themselves in meetings. Her manager, a sharp, image-conscious director named Richard, had a specific way of running the room. He rewarded confidence over competence, volume over quality. Elena watched people with half her skill get praised in meetings for talking a good game, while her actual work, the work that made those same campaigns succeed, went uncredited, quietly folded into someone else's presentation. She told herself, for a long time, that this was simply how the industry worked, that eventually the quality of her work would speak for itself. She kept her head down. She kept improving. She assumed, the way most of us assume, that fairness was simply delayed, not absent. Then came the meeting that changed everything. The agency had lost a major client, a decision made well above Elena's level, for reasons that had nothing to do with her work. But Richard needed someone to blame in front of the partners, and in the review meeting that followed, he looked directly at Elena and said, in front of her entire team, "Some people just aren't cut out for this industry. I think we all know who I mean." She was let go within the week, with a severance package that felt, in that moment, less like compensation and more like a formality attached to her own public humiliation. She sat in her car in the agency parking lot that final afternoon, box of desk items on the passenger seat, and felt something she hadn't expected, not just sadness, but a very specific, cold clarity. 3 years of her actual best work, reduced in one sentence, in front of everyone she'd worked alongside, to not cut out for this. The worst part wasn't even the firing. It was that some small, tired part of her almost believed him. She sat there long enough for the parking lot lights to click on automatically, replaying the meeting in her head, trying to locate the exact moment it had gone from ordinary corporate blame shifting to something aimed specifically and personally at her. She couldn't find one. It hadn't built gradually. It had simply arrived, fully formed, the way a verdict does, delivered with enough confidence that for a few minutes, sitting alone in that car, she found herself genuinely auditing 3 years of her own work for evidence that he might have been right, rather than auditing his motives for saying it. That's the part one think is worth naming clearly, because it happens to almost everyone who's been on the receiving end of a sentence like that. The content of the accusation matters less than the confidence with which it's delivered. Richard hadn't presented evidence. He'd presented certainty, in front of an audience, and certainty, even entirely unearned certainty, has a way of borrowing credibility it hasn't actually done anything to deserve. I'll tell you exactly what happened on that stage, 11 months later, and exactly what the man who fired her said when their eyes met across that room. But first, you need to understand the specific conversation, 3 days after she was fired, that changed the entire direction of what came next. 3 days after being let go, Elena was sitting in a small coffee shop near her apartment, laptop open to a job board she couldn't bring herself to actually scroll through, when an older woman at the next table struck up a conversation about the coffee shop's slow Wi-Fi. They got talking, the easy way strangers sometimes do, and eventually the woman asked what Elena did for work. Elena told her, flatly, including the firing, including Richard's exact words, surprising herself with how easily it came out to a total stranger. The woman listened without interrupting, then said something that stayed with Elena far longer than the conversation itself. "I spent 20 years being told by other people what I was and wasn't cut out for," she said. "The year I stopped asking their permission to find out for myself was the best year of my career." She introduced herself as Dana, the founder of a small but respected independent design studio 2 neighborhoods over, a studio Elena actually recognized, having admired their work from a distance for years without ever making the connection to the woman sitting across from her. Dana asked to see Elena's portfolio, right there, on her laptop. She scrolled through it slowly, asked pointed, specific questions about certain projects, the kind of questions that showed she actually understood the work, not just its surface polish. Then she said something direct: "This is genuinely good work. Whoever told you otherwise was protecting his own position, not describing your talent." She didn't offer Elena a job. She offered something more specific, and in hindsight, more valuable: "I take on exactly 1 apprentice a year, unpaid for the first 3 months, brutal hours, no guarantees. Most people who start don't finish. If you want it, it's yours." Elena asked the obvious question: why unpaid, why brutal, why no guarantee? Dana said, "Because I only want the ones willing to prove it to themselves, not to me. I've had plenty of naturally talented people quit in month 1 because talent alone doesn't survive difficulty. I've had plenty of moderately talented people build extraordinary careers because they did." She wrote her studio's address on a napkin. "Monday, 8 a.m., if you're serious." Elena almost didn't go. She spent that entire weekend running through reasonable-sounding arguments against it. She needed a paying job immediately, not an unpaid trial with no guarantee. She didn't actually know this woman. 3 months unpaid was, by any conventional financial logic, a genuinely reckless decision for someone who just lost her income. Every one of those arguments was, on its own, entirely reasonable. What finally moved her past all of them wasn't confidence that it would work out. It was the specific, uncomfortable realization that if she didn't go, she'd spend the next several years of job applications quietly wondering whether Richard's sentence had actually been true, without ever having created a real test of it. Uncertainty about the studio felt survivable. Permanent uncertainty about herself did not. Before we continue, answer this honestly in the comments: has anyone ever told you, directly or indirectly, that you weren't cut out for something you actually cared about? What was it, and what did you do with that sentence? I promise you, reading the replies under a video like this is one of the more validating things you'll do this week. You'll see exactly how many people are carrying some version of the same sentence Elena carried out of that meeting. Elena showed up Monday at 8 a.m. sharp. What happened over the following 11 months wasn't a single dramatic moment, it was a specific, repeatable system Dana taught her, one that had almost nothing to do with talent and everything to do with a particular kind of discipline most people quietly give up on. Dana's studio operated on a principle she stated plainly on Elena's first morning: nobody here gets credit for potential. You get credit for finished, shipped work, and nothing else counts. She handed Elena a stack of real client briefs, not busy work, not practice exercises, actual paying work with actual deadlines, and told her to treat every single one as if her entire reputation depended on it, because eventually, it would. The first month was brutal in exactly the way Dana had warned. Elena worked unpaid, 12-hour days, redoing work Dana rejected without much explanation beyond, "This isn't there yet," again. 3 other apprentices had started the same week Elena had. By the end of month 1, 2 of them had quit. Elena understood why, some mornings, more than she wanted to admit. What kept her showing up, she told me later, wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was a specific, quiet decision she'd made in that parking lot the day she was fired, that she would find out, definitively, for herself, whether Richard had been right about her, rather than simply carrying his sentence around unexamined for the rest of her career. The unpaid months weren't really about the money she wasn't making. They were about finally getting an honest answer to a question she'd never actually tested. By month 3, something shifted. Dana started rejecting Elena's work less often, and when she did, the feedback got more specific, more technical, less about fundamentals and more about refinement, the kind of feedback you give someone once you've stopped questioning whether they belong in the room at all. Elena started recognizing her own growth in small, concrete ways. A layout that used to take her 6 drafts now took 2. A client note that used to send her into a spiral of self-doubt now read, simply, as information to act on. Dana gave her 3 principles early on that Elena wrote inside the cover of her sketchbook and referred back to constantly. 1. Finished and imperfect beats perfect and never shipped, every single time. 2. The work that scares you a little is usually the work that's actually teaching you something. Comfortable work rarely does. 3. Talent gets you noticed once. Consistency is the only thing that gets you kept. By month 6, Elena had been moved from unpaid apprentice to a paid junior position within the studio, not because Dana had softened, but because Elena's work had genuinely earned it, project after project, without a single dramatic breakthrough moment, just a slow, compounding accumulation of finished, shipped, increasingly confident work. Elena told me one detail from those middle months that stuck with me more than almost anything else in her story. Around month 4, she'd ask Dana, half joking, when she'd know she was actually good at this. Dana had laughed, not unkindly, and said, "That question is the wrong question. You'll never get a single clean moment where the doubt just switches off permanently. What happens instead, if you keep showing up, is that the doubt gets quieter and less relevant, one finished project at a time, until one day you notice you haven't thought about the question in weeks." That turned out to be almost exactly how it happened, not a dramatic turning point, but a gradual, almost imperceptible fading of a question that had once felt urgent enough to define her entire sense of whether she belonged in the field at all. I want to add one honest complication here, because the story isn't as clean as, she worked hard and everything worked out. Around month 8, Elena nearly quit, not from exhaustion, but from a specific moment of doubt that had nothing to do with the work itself. She ran into a former colleague from the old agency, who mentioned, casually, that Richard had been promoted, that the firm was doing well, that nobody there talked about Elena's firing anymore at all. It had simply been forgotten, absorbed into the ordinary churn of office life, as if it had never mattered enough to remember. That should have felt freeing. Instead, for about a week, it felt oddly deflating. She realized she'd been quietly building towards some imagined future confrontation, some moment where her success would land as a direct, felt consequence for Richard. Discovering that he'd simply moved on, unaffected, forced her to confront an uncomfortable question: if he never even noticed, was any of this still worth it? Dana, when Elena finally admitted this to her, didn't offer much comfort. She said, plainly, if you're building this for him, you'll always be disappointed, because he was never going to give you the reaction you're looking for. Build it because you finally get to find out what you're actually capable of. That answer doesn't need his attention to be real. It wasn't an easy thing to hear, but it was the thing that got Elena through the rest of that year with her motivation intact, redirected towards something that didn't depend on anyone else noticing at all. Now, some of you are thinking, fairly, not everyone has a Dana. Not everyone meets a mentor in a coffee shop 3 days after disaster strikes. That's true, and it's worth naming directly rather than pretending mentors appear reliably for everyone. But look closely at what Dana actually provided, separate from her specific presence: real, unglamorous work to practice on, honest feedback instead of polite feedback, and a structure that rewarded finished output over talked about potential. None of those 3 things strictly require a specific person named Dana. You can assign yourself real briefs from real, even unpaid, even self-initiated, projects. You can seek out honest feedback deliberately, from people who won't simply flatter you. You can build your own structure that rewards shipping over merely planning. The mentor made it faster and less lonely. She wasn't the only possible source of the actual mechanism underneath the story. I'd add one more thing here, because it's easy to romanticize the mentor and miss the less flattering truth underneath Elena's story. Dana didn't rescue her. Dana gave her a genuinely difficult opportunity with real risk of failure attached, and Elena still had to survive 3 unpaid, exhausting months on her own effort before any of it paid off. If you're waiting for your own version of that coffee shop conversation before you start, you may be waiting for the wrong prerequisite. The conversation only mattered because Elena was already prepared to act on it. The opportunity found someone who was ready to do something difficult with it. It didn't create that readiness out of nothing. So here's what to actually take from this. First, separate the sentence from the verdict. Someone telling you that you're not cut out for something is one person's opinion, delivered for their own reasons, in a specific moment. It is not a verified fact about your ceiling. Elena's mistake, briefly, was almost believing Richard's sentence simply because of the confidence with which it was delivered. Second, find real work to practice on, not just exercises. Growth compounds fastest on work with actual stakes and actual deadlines, even small ones, even unpaid ones for a defined period, not endless private practice with no external accountability. Third, seek out honest feedback specifically, not comfortable feedback. Dana's early feedback to Elena was blunt almost to the point of discomfort. That bluntness is what made the growth real instead of merely reassuring. Fourth, track finished, shipped work, not potential. Keep a literal list, if it helps, of things you actually completed and sent out into the world, however small. Potential feels good to talk about. Finished work is the only thing that actually compounds. Fifth, decouple your effort from anyone else's reaction to it, the way Dana forced Elena to. If your motivation depends on a specific person noticing, being impressed, or feeling regret, you've built your entire project on something you don't control. Build it for the honest answer to your own question instead. 11 months after being fired, Elena's studio, Dana's studio, with Elena now leading two of its biggest ongoing accounts, was nominated for a regional design award for a campaign Elena had led from concept to delivery. She stood on that stage to accept it on the studio's behalf, and scanning the audience out of habit more than expectation, she saw Richard, seated near the back, there representing his own agency's much smaller nomination in a different category. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. He gave a small, unreadable nod, not an apology, not really an acknowledgement of anything specific, just the kind of nod you give someone you vaguely recognize in a room. Elena said, describing it later, that she'd expected to feel triumphant in that exact moment, the way she might have imagined it in the early, angrier months. What she actually felt was smaller and quieter than that, relief, mostly, and a strange, settled confirmation that she already knew the honest answer to the question she'd been carrying since that parking lot. She hadn't needed his nod to know it. She'd known it for months already, in the accumulated evidence of finished work behind her. She told me she'd rehearsed, at some point during those angrier early months, an entire imagined conversation with Richard, something clever and pointed she'd say if she ever ran into him again. Standing on that stage, she realized she'd genuinely forgotten every line of it. There was simply nothing left that needed saying. The award, the studio, the 11 months of finished work, all of it had already answered the question far more completely than any sentence she could have delivered to him in person ever would have. Elena leads her own small team at the studio now. Dana still takes exactly one apprentice a year, and Elena sits in on those first interviews sometimes, recognizing something of herself in the ones who show up nervous, unsure whether they actually belong in the room. Here's the part of Elena's story I think matters most, more than the award, more than the moment in the audience. The 11 months that mattered weren't really about proving Richard wrong. They were about the version of Elena that existed on the other side of finding out, definitively, for herself, whether his sentence had been true. It wasn't. But she only knew that for certain because she did the actual work required to test it, rather than either accepting the sentence quietly or simply resenting it from a distance forever. I think about how easily this could have gone differently, how close she came, in that parking lot, to simply absorbing Richard's sentence as fact, filing it away as an explanation for whatever came next in a smaller, more cautious career. Most people, understandably, do exactly that. The sentence lands, and rather than testing it, they quietly reorganize their expectations around it, treating someone else's confident opinion as though it were a verified limit. The difference in Elena's story isn't that she never doubted herself, she clearly did, repeatedly, for months. The difference is that she kept showing up anyway, long enough to let the actual evidence, rather than one person's confident sentence, have the final word. So here's your challenge. If someone has ever told you what you're not cut out for, scroll down and tell me exactly what they said, and what you're going to do to actually test whether it was true. Not someday. Name one concrete step you'll take this week. I read every single comment, and I think you'll find a surprising number of strangers carrying the exact same sentence you are, waiting for the same permission to finally go test it themselves. And if this video is what finally pushes you to test yours, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of real, unglamorous, honest story this channel exists to keep telling. The sentence someone gave you was never the verdict. It was just an opinion, delivered with confidence. Go find out the actual answer for yourself.